A very pleasant good evening to you. It is Tuesday, October 9th, 2018. We're coming at you just after 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and you're listening to a special presentation of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. This is a very unique show. It's something that we've never done before, but I think that you're really going to enjoy this. It's something unique in our catalog of wrestling history talk. We're looking at the 2018 Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame ballot. We're going through the list tonight. We're going to talk about some of the big names that are on there. A lot of wrestling history to talk about, all through the different eras of the business, from the territories up to the modern era. Some wrestling personalities that have helped make this business so much fun to watch as a fan. It's going to be a great discussion, and here to help me unpack everything is the Connoisseurs of Wrestling's newest host. He is also a member of the Two Guys One Sport team, broadcasting Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. Mr. George Atsaves. George, my friend, this is going to be one hell of a show. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Kensington, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this. I've been looking forward to this for a few weeks now. I'm not a voter, although I'm angling for a ballot for next year. However, this is my favorite time of year is to talk the historical people, and some active. There are some of these people on this ballot are absolutely in the prime of their careers, as we'll discuss. And it's I'm looking forward to picking your brain, and I hope you're looking forward to picking mine.
Absolutely, and that's it's so funny that you mentioned that. We were looking at the ballot earlier. There were some people discussing it over at Cage Side Seats, and they were talking about how it's so shocking. Some of the names that were on this year's ballot that are not already in the Hall of Fame compared to some of the people who are still actively competing that you wouldn't even suspect would have the longevity to even be on the ballot this early in their careers. It's just such an interesting discussion because it's such a dichotomy between the historical figures and today's superstars across the world through all sorts of different promotions. It's just a completely fascinating subject to talk about because there's so many different ways you could tackle who should get in, who shouldn't. Of course, there's set criteria that the Wrestling Observer holds to be nominated, and there are certain criteria that they're looking for in these performers to actually be selected. But we'll get into all of that. We're going to go through the list of the nominees this year that are official candidates for induction into the Observer Hall of Fame. The Observer Hall of Fame, just a brief bit of background, of course, that's the product of Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter, one of the most famous publications in the wrestling industry for going on, oh gosh, maybe 35 years.
Early 80s, I think.
Yeah, so even
my entire wrestling fandom has been in some part. The Observer's been a part of my entire wrestling fandom. I remember getting my first subscription when I was in junior high. My uncle bought me a subscription when I was, 96, and it was definitely well in its prime then. So, and it started, I think the early 80s is when it started.
That would be about right. That's generally when the first awards go out. So I would imagine that's probably about when he started covering. Say what you will about Dave Meltzer, but in the early days of the internet, he was a god figure among internet wrestling fans. What Meltzer said went. His word was basically gospel. So very influential person in the wrestling business, and he has a very influential Hall of Fame to boot. A lot of people have a lot of respect for his opinions, for the opinions of those who are voting in this. It's a big honor, and it's an honor that a lot of wrestlers, especially in the business over the last 15 to 30 years, they really take seriously. So we're going to break down the ballot. We're going to look at some of the names. We were just talking off air a moment ago of how shocking some of these names are. You look at these and you think, why aren't they already in? And that's just a testament to the fact that, this Hall of Fame is taken seriously. They have credentials, they have criteria that they focus on, and if you don't meet those criteria, no matter how good your name looks, you don't get in. And so it's an important list to kind of break down, as much as wrestling fans of the business as it is, fans of the contemporary product, because we do have some current names that are making waves, especially in Japan right now, that are on this year's ballot. So, George, without any further ado, let's just go ahead and go through some of the list.
Sure.
You sent me the link earlier. I'm going to let you kind of talk about how this list is broken down. It's actually divided into several different categories here.
Let me explain the criteria first and foremost. Set the stage. Inductees must have at least 15 years of experience in the wrestling business or be over the age of 35 and have 10 years. That lets late bloomers, like, for example, and he's not on the ballot, but I got like Dave Bautista, who started relatively late in life.
Right.
As long as he serves his 10 years and is over 35, he is in the on the ballot. Would be on the ballot. He'd be eligible. We'll talk about the age of 35 when we get to the modern era candidates and about that later. The criteria are as follows. There are 3 criteria: in-ring ability, drawing ability, and the always nebulous positive historical significance. And when in doubt, longevity matters. It's unless you had a transcendent 2-3 year run, that isn't going to be good enough. It's more important that you show your in-ring ability, drawing power, and positive historical significance over as long a period of time as possible.
So basically, to get into this Hall of Fame, it's not just a matter of having a big run. You really need to be able to sustain that run. You have to have sustained success in the business. You have to have a lot of tenure, basically. You need to be able to prove that not only could you get it done in the ring, and not only could you be a significant contributor to the territories you work for, you needed to be able to do this over a prolonged period of time. And so that, I think, separates kind of the flash in the pans from the people who really made a mark in the wrestling business.
Go on. I'm sorry.
No, that's basically what he's looking for in the criteria.
We talked about this a little off the air, my friend. There's a lot of feel in this Hall of Fame. This isn't Major League Baseball or the NFL or the NBA where you can say, oh, this guy scored 25,000 points, therefore he's a Hall of Famer. A basketball player, oh, so-and-so had 500 touchdowns, he's a Hall of Famer. Like, there's a lot of wrestling isn't like that. There's a lot of gut feeling, instinct. Does this person feel like a Hall of Famer? Here's why not. Which is kind of what I think the crux of this show will turn into.
So, we have quite a few names here that cross different eras of the business. We're talking as far back into the 50s. Some of these names go into the 40s and 30s, but from the 50s and 60s of the territorial era all the way into the modern age, and including, as we mentioned, some of the current participants in the business in terms of modern performers. We also have the wrestling personalities. These are non-wrestlers who are also included in the discussion for nomination into the Hall of Fame. These would be guys like promoters, wrestling commentators, announcers, managers, other personalities associated with the business. One name in particular on the top of the list that we'll talk about later, Bill Apter, of course, important in the wrestling periodicals, magazines, Pro Wrestling Illustrated for a number of years. And so basically anyone that has a tangible relationship to the wrestling business in some capacity could also receive induction. So it's not just in-ring performers so much as it is pretty much anyone in the larger fraternity that is pro wrestling.
Agreed. Do you want to just pick a category and go at it, my friend? Or do you want to reveal who you voted for and then go from there? Or how do you want to do it?
I'll tell you what. Why don't we break down the actual nominees first, and we can save the people we would put forward towards the end.
That works. We call that a hook in the radio business.
Hey, we're professionals here. That's what we do. I would say we just go from the top down, and we can start with the historical performers. This is probably the most robust of the categories, at least on a glance, and it's also a very interesting category.
In order to be eligible to be a historical performer and not a modern era performer, which is a different category, your peak has to have been more than 30 years ago. That's the cutoff. So if your peak was less than 30 years ago, you're a modern era, and if your peak was more than 30 years ago, you're a historical. That's the line to separate one category from the other.
Yeah. So we are basically looking at, people who would have been big draws in the wrestling business in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Once we get into the 70s, we're approaching that point where this is going to be cut off and not pertinent to this particular category. Just looking at some of these names, going to read off a few of them. There are some on here that we just don't have a lot of knowledge on. Guys like Johnny Barron, don't know much about him, or Wild Bill Curry. But then there are some names on here that would definitely be pertinent to talk about. We have June Byers, Cowboy Bob Ellis, Don Fargo. One of my personal favorites, Archie Goldie, the Mongolian
Stomper. Rest in peace, man.
That's a name that, especially if you were a Stampede Wrestling fan, you remember Archie Goldie very well. Chavo Guerrero Sr., Chavo Classic. Rocky Johnson, the Soul Man. We got #1 Paul Jones. That's the Carolina staple. Sputnik Monroe. Now, Sputnik, we're going to have a conversation on him because he's one of the names that I'm putting forward. Very prominent in the Memphis area. A very important wrestler for civil rights. He had a big role to play in the integration movement of the pro wrestling scene in Memphis. Very historical figure. Sputnik Monroe, we can talk a little bit about him. Of course, we've got Blackjack Mulligan, Johnny Rougeau, George the Animal Steel. That's one name that you would think might have already been in. John Tolos, Enrique Torres, the Von Brauners, and Saul Weingroff. You got me on that one. Bearcat Wright, a very popular African-American performer in the 50s and 60s. And Mr. Wrestling 2, Johnny Walter. That's a very robust list of some very big names from the territory era, and there's some big names in the wrestling business overall. Out of the historical performers, anyone catching your eye in particular that you want to talk about, or anyone that you know from ahead of time that really had an impact on your personal fandom?
On my personal fandom, no. But I do want. I'm not voting for this gentleman, but I did want to make a little bit of a case for Rocky Johnson, the Soul Man. Married into the Samoan family, father of the Rock, but on his own, multiple-time tag team champion, multiple-time United States champion in various promotions, Hawaii, California especially. And I know you can't really play this game, but I wonder how high a guy like that would have been pushed if he wasn't an African American in the 1960s and 1970s. As unfortunate as it is to say that, it is unfortunately a reality that he did run into that glass ceiling in a lot of territories.
You know something about Rocky Johnson that I find really fascinating, and we could talk, and this is a pertinent discussion to talk about Bearcat Wright as well, because Bearcat faced a lot of those challenges a little bit before Rocky Johnson's time. But it's definitely a testament to, not only physical toughness, but mental toughness. You had to be mentally tough to be in the wrestling business, period. But that was just so much more elevated, escalated almost, if you will, when you talk about performers of color, especially African-American performers working in the Southern Territories. It's one thing to get over. It's another thing to get over if you are a person of color during the era of segregation or, immediately following. And so, Rocky Johnson, he had a tremendous run in the state of Florida. Tremendous run. And, Florida, although we joke and say it's not truly a southern state or whatnot, it's close enough for government work in this time period. So.
And this was before a lot of the northern migration. This was when Florida was much more southern than it would end up being in 2018.
Right.
So, and for him to get as over as he got in multiple territories and be a good enough of an in-ring worker. I mean, the guy's not, Kazuchika Okada, but for his era, he did not have to be. And he was still good. He wasn't a stiff. And to be in multiple tag teams that were successful, I came very close to having him on my final ballot. I couldn't quite pull the trigger. But I wanted to highlight him. I wanted to highlight him for the purposes of this show.
And it's a good highlight. And this is a recurring thing that you're going to have throughout this ballot process when you're looking at these nominees. There's going to be people who may not make the final cut, but absolutely will be people that you want to just recognize and honor. And like Paul Jones is a name that I would put forward to recognize, not to actually vote through, because Paul Jones is actually kind of a running gag. He's more known for being a bad manager than he was for being a good regional tag team wrestler, which is how he broke into the business in the Carolinas in the 60s and 70s. He was a great tag team wrestler, but everyone remembers him from his run as a manager, and it wasn't exactly the most stellar of managerial runs. We're talking Dungeon of Doom levels of kind of comical badness here. But still, someone who had a big impact on the wrestling business and someone who deserves their 15 minutes of glory, in the present day, kind of recognition, so to speak. Archie Goldie, I would say the same general category as Paul Jones. It's not someone that I would put forward necessarily as being, Hall of Fame bound, but he's someone who made a very big impact in the territorial era, especially up north in Canada. Stampede Wrestling, he had one of the great all-time feuds of Stampede Wrestling. Archie Goldie coming to the aid of his son, cutting one of the great promos in the history of the business. Just some absolutely fantastic work. Stampede fans know exactly the angle that we're referring to. So, there's just these names on the list that deserve recognition, even if we're not putting them forward. Is there any one of the historical performers era candidates that you think you would put forward or you're considering putting forward?
There's one that I voted for. Do you want me to name him now, or do you want to save it till the end?
I tell you what, we can go ahead and talk about it now. We might as well.
You mentioned him, but I think Sputnik Monroe is a slam dunk.
Yes.
When you talk about the fact that he was a draw in Memphis for years and years and years and years, that in and of itself was impressive. But when you talk about how he more or less single-handedly desegregated in a major southern city, I mean that's a slam dunk to me, an absolute slam dunk. The steps he took to desegregate by desegregating the crowds in Memphis. Black patrons would be given the cheap seats and would be forced to sit in the cheap seats, and he eventually said, "I'm not going to perform unless blacks can sit where they want, or they have the money to sit where they want. If they have the $2 to pay for a ticket on the floor, they should be allowed to sit for the $2 to sit at the ticket on the floor." I mean, it's a no-brainer in 2018, but in the 50s when he did this, in the 60s, that was a gigantic deal. And he said, "I will not wrestle unless you seat these patrons where they belong." And he was important enough to that territory that the promoters eventually caved. And you may say, "Oh, who cares? It's a small victory," but it's a victory, Biff. It's a victory nonetheless. And that is such a big deal to me to start to just to stand up for what's right and in a way that could not have been easy. In no way, shape, and form could that have been an easy decision. So, but for him to do the right thing is just, to me, that is the positive historical significance that we're looking for here.
Absolutely. That's this one in particular. Sputnik Monroe may not be a household name in the larger context of professional wrestling business, but if we're talking about historical contributions to the business and historical personalities within the business that really made a positive impact, Sputnik Monroe is very high up on the list. You're talking about someone who willingly allowed himself to be arrested because he would frequent coffee shops and other restaurants that were owned by black citizens in in Memphis, at a time where it was illegal for white patrons to go into those types of facilities. I mean, he would willingly allow himself to be arrested just because he, wanted to kind of highlight kind of the futility of segregation in Memphis in that era. And to this day, Sputnik Monroe is probably behind only Jerry Lawler in terms of historical wrestling figures in the city of Memphis.
Which was a major city in wrestling history.
Exactly. It's one thing to be a popular wrestling figure from Dallas or from San Francisco. It's another thing to be popular in Memphis because the wrestling tradition in Memphis goes back so far and so long, and is still such a pertinent part of the local culture there. Sputnik Monroe, from a historical perspective and his work to end segregation in the wrestling business in Memphis and locally too, it's not just his work inside the business, but it was his public stance outside the business went a long way. He really deserves this honor. Honestly, I'm surprised that he's not been inducted before now. But I think we both have him on our final ballots, pushing him forward. And
yeah, I mean, I don't use this term lightly, but he is a hero of his era for the stuff that he did to highlight the hypocrisy and the evils of segregation.
I just wish that he had a different first name than Sputnik. It's so Cold War.
I mean, he was born Roscoe, so maybe Sputnik is better.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Roscoe Monroe, it's definitely got a redneck quality about it.
Yeah.
So it would have been against type for his character. I've got one other name out of the historical performers era that I'm putting forward.
Okay.
And this one is a tough one because when you think about in-ring quality, your first impression of this performer may not necessarily be work rate oriented. That may not be what first comes to mind. But I've had the pleasure of watching some of his old work. I've seen him at his peak and not at his cartoonish phase, which is what most people would remember him from. He's actually a very well-spoken individual. He just passed away a few years ago, but he was very well thought of in the business. He was very well liked, very well respected, not only for his contributions to the business, but his insights into the business. He was one of the best resources that Sean Oliver had when he was doing some of his chronicles of the 1980s wrestling scene in the WWF. I put forward George Steele. I think George Steele, in terms of longevity, definitely makes a case. He was, selling out Madison Square Garden as far back as the 1960s. One of the preeminent heels in the wrestling business at that time. He definitely drew money. He had very successful runs with all of the big baby faces that came through the WWF and the WWF from a period stretching Bruno Sammartino all the way into the Hulk Hogan years. He had money drawing angles with Hulk Hogan in 1984 before he kind of had his little babyface turn and became the George Steele that everyone kind of saw as the company went national. He was a better wrestler than people give him credit for. A lot of people saw him as he got older. He slowed down a little bit, and he kind of accentuated the crazy persona. But we were talking last night on the show about Abdullah the Butcher and kind of representing kind of the monster heel, the cooler, the guy that goes in and just knocks you back a peg because he's just so tough and so brazenly out there. And George Steele in the 70s represented very much an Abdullah-like presence, an unsettling, dangerous persona in the ring that had no bones about getting down and dirty and making sure to just beat the piss out of you. And you compare that with his run later on in his career, it's like night and day. I have to go with George Steele on my ballot simply from the perspective he was one of the biggest heels and one of the most consistent heel draws to go up against a Bruno Sammartino, a Pedro Morales, a Bob Backlund. And when you're talking about the great heavyweight champions of the WWF in the early years, they're only as good as the heels they work against. Bruno had to have his George Steeles, his Don Leo Jonathans, his Ivan Koloffs, his Gorilla Monsoons to draw. It's not just a matter of the Superman. Superman has to have Lex Luthor. And so for that reason alone, I'm putting George Steele on my ballot because he was one of the top heels in one of the top territories for a long, long time.
Well said. I think that's exactly what we're looking for here, my friend. I'm not quite there, but I could be talked into it, and you're doing a damn fine job of talking me into it.
Well, if you give me like 15 extra minutes, I have some property to sell you in Kansas too. Oceanfront, nice view. But we'll move on from the historical performers era. I'd like, if with your permission, I'd like to jump actually ahead and not touch on the modern performers just yet. Maybe we'd come back to the modern performers at the end. I would like to look at the wrestling nominees from Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, and Africa, because this is another interesting list filled with names that may not be household names to fans in America. But if you're a fan in Britain, you will immediately recognize some of the names on this list. If you're a longtime wrestling fan of the WWF, back from the territorial era, you'll recognize a couple of names on this list. And if you're a fan of the AWA, there's absolutely one name that you'll recognize on this list. Former AWA heavyweight champion made the nominees. You want to run down the list of nominees from this category?
The names we have are Spiros Arion, good Greek boy, much like myself. Big Daddy, who many words have been shed pro and con in the past, and I imagine we'll have some. We'll shed some words on him. Long-time British heavyweight. Dominic DeNucci, trainer of Mick Foley, among other people. Horst Hoffman, Billy Joyce, Killer Carl Cox. Unfortunate initials, but you know, what are you going to do? Mario Milano, Kendo Nagasaki, another longtime British wrestling guy. Jackie Pallo, a name I'm sure you'll have something to say about. Rollerball Mark Rocco, Johnny Saint, Ricky Starr, and Otto Wanz, or Wanz. Otto Wanz is an interesting name, my friend.
I've always been confused as to whether Otto Wanz is a good wrestler or he just got very lucky being in the spot to take in favors from Byrne. I've not made that determination yet, and it bugs me that having listened to stories about Otto Wanz for going on 20 years now, I've never seen a match of his. Never have I seen a match featuring this man. And yet he has been such a pertinent part of AWA lore. And, you know, we've talked, you know, at length about the American Wrestling Association on the Connoisseurs. It's definitely one of the hallmark promotions of our early shows run. Never seen an Otto Wanz match. But there's some interesting names on this list. And
there are.
Is there any name in wrestling history greater than Rollerball Mark Rocco?
It's a great name. The name alone is Hall of Fame worthy.
It's a freaking fantastic name. And, you know, Johnny Saint, another great one. And, of course, if you're a fan of NXT UK, Johnny Saint, obviously, very much familiar to you. He is the commissioner figure for the NXT UK brand right now, but he's also a great wrestler in his own right. I got to be honest, I was a little bit surprised and confused at first. Kendo Nagasaki, for those of you that don't know, there's actually two Kendo Nagasakis. Now, on this list, because it's considering Europe and Australia, I'm guessing that Kendo Nagasaki is referring to the British performer that portrayed him, Peter Thornley.
I believe that is true. I believe that is true, but I don't know that for sure.
There's another performer from actual Japanese performer, Kazuo Sakurada, who also portrayed Kendo Nagasaki elsewhere. And the reason that this is important, Sakurada actually is one of the preeminent figures that trained Bret Hart. Very prominent wrestling trainer, in addition to being a wrestling personality, had some time spent in Calgary and helped Bret Hart kind of get on his feet and get going in the wrestling business. So you've got two different Kendo Nagasaki's running around at different points, but definitely Nagasaki, Peter Thornley's incarnation under the mask in Britain, one of the preeminent wrestlers from the World of Sport era, ditto Rollerball Mark Rocco. Of course, some of his feuds with legends like Marty Jones and Johnny Saint obviously stand out here. For those that are watching the territorial era, of course, names like Dominic DeNucci and Spiros Arion would definitely ring a bell. Spiros Arion had one of the great followings in the WWF among the Greek community. back in the days when the WWF was almost like a coalition of the old city states. You know, the Italian fans had their Hero and Bruto, and here comes Spiros Arion for the Greek fans, and Pedro Morales for the Puerto Rican fans, and
I mean, why do you think Terry Bollea chose the name Hulk Hogan to appeal to ethnic fans?
Needed the Irish.
I mean, it's such a huge part of professional wrestling, in that part of the world, in that part of the era, in that era, it is just appealing to your fan base. You know, and Spiros Arion was a hero to his people, just like Bruno was to his. And Pedro Morales was to his, and you said it.
Well, that kind of wrestling could only work in New York with the population centers. Yeah, the population centers in the Northeast are so much more culturally diverse than some of the other cities in the country. You have such large pockets of fans, and especially in that era when entertainment options were not as robust as they are now. I mean, now, my God, you've got 5 million channels on television, the internet. You've got all means of entertaining yourself.
You got this podcast.
There you go. Entertaining the millions and millions of wrestling history buffs out there. But back in the day, wrestling, much like other sporting events, was kind of a cultural meeting ground. It was neutral ground for all the different factions to come in, and everyone had their favorites. And like you said, Greek fans gravitated towards Arian. I didn't put him forward on my ballots, but he's absolutely worthy of mention here because he did have a very long, very successful career, and he did draw money.
He did.
Like a lot of those different stars from the WWF era did in the 70s. Had a very prolific run and a very positive impact on the business as a whole because, we're looking at all of the international wrestlers that comprise the main roster of the WWF today, or the gaijin performers that go into Japan and make a name for themselves. The boundaries, these international boundaries are starting to really come down between wrestling promotions, and you see Western performers having success in the East, and you see performers from Europe or Africa or Australia have success here in the West. And, a lot of that is due to the cultural heritage that people like Arian presented, where he made it acceptable for Greek performers to come in and be big stars. Ivan Putski in Houston, maybe not so much in New York, but in Houston definitely was a huge star. When he comes to New York, here comes Polish power, Ivan Putski. So he's introducing Polish infusion into the wrestling business. Like we said, Hulk Hogan took on the name Hogan to try and tap into the Irish heritage. Bruno, the Italian fans, it's just this pollination of performers, whether they were American or whether they were Greek or Italian or Swiss or Polish, as the case may be. You have this infusion of just a melting pot. And today, I think it just shows in the diversity we have on the main roster. You've got Canadians, you've got Europeans, you've got people from Japan and China and Australia, just going at it. And really and truly, the borders are coming down in the wrestling world, and that's opening up so many diverse styles for fans. I mean, can you imagine going back 30 years ago and just imagining what the basic level of wrestling quality would be from an in-ring perspective? I was weaned on guys like Jake Roberts and Tugboat, who were amazing characters in their own right, but they're not doing the kinds of athletic moves that people like Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods and Cesaro, they're doing today. We just take it for granted how great wrestling is from an in-ring perspective now, and it's owed a lot to people in the 70s kind of breaking down those borders for them.
And making it acceptable.
Right.
That your gimmick could be, I am a wrestler of X origin and have it be taken seriously.
Exactly. It's they're paving the way in a very real sense for the people that we're watching today. So,
is there any modern era, or historical or Oh, wow. Are there any candidates from this category that you would vote for that made your final ballot?
This was the toughest category by far to try and decipher whether someone was going forward. In the end, I did put a wrestler on my ballot, and it might be a shocking wrestler. It may not be a name that people gravitate towards immediately, but I think if you've been around the business long enough, if you've been a fan for long enough, you've probably heard of him. I chose Ricky Starr.
Okay. Tell me. I don't know anything about him. Tell me about Ricky Starr. That's why I'm glad we're doing this show.
Ricky Starr is a performer who is of the same general vein as Gorgeous George Wagner. Very flamboyant, very colorful, animated in the ring. He is not your quintessential 1950s professional wrestler who's coming in there with the ring jacket, very stoic, doing the warm-ups in the corner, signing the autographs. He is very animated. He's portraying a character. This very, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it, almost acrobatic-like, almost like a wrestling ballerina. The way he moved around the ring, the way he carried himself, he was very much in the model of a George Wagner, where he not only relied on his in-ring ability, but his personality, his colorful persona. If you go and look at some of his images from Google, you see him doing literal poses, these ballerina poses, just to draw heat. You know, this almost effeminate style that was so opposite of what was considered to be right and proper for wrestlers of the 50s. You know, you have your all-American heroes like Vern Gagne and Lou Thez and, you know, Ed Strangler Lewis, maybe a little bit earlier for the 50s. But the guys that just define the quintessential tough wrestler. And then here comes individuals like George Wagner, who has to have his hair sprayed down before he gets in the ring because he's so, you know, hoity-toity. And here comes Ricky Starr, and he's dancing in the ring, and he's sitting here posing, and you're like, is this guy a wrestler? Is he a ballerina? Is he, you know, just got a screw loose upstairs? You don't know what's coming. And then, despite all of that posh veneer, is an athlete who was really ahead of his time. He could really perform well in the ring, and he used that agility, those acrobatic-like maneuvers, and that just flair for the dramatic, and he really forged himself into one of the great early stars in the television era. And in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about British wrestlers and their importance to the overall business here in the United States, Ricky Starr is definitely going to be up on the list of important and influential figures that made a big impact. Maybe as much of an impact as Billy Robinson. Whereas Robinson was known as the quintessential shooter and the guy that's training people to stretch you and hook you and make you sign over your will and everything else, you know, just by virtue of joint manipulation. Ricky Starr is manipulating you emotionally. He is designed as a character to make you want to see him get his face punched in. He was a great wrestling heel. He was a great wrestler and a very influential one, very much ahead of his time, and very tough too. Don't let the gimmick fool you. He was just as tough as any of those British wrestlers. He could hook you if he wanted to. But Ricky Starr, he's kind of the forerunner to a character today. I'm trying to think of someone who he would resemble today.
Velveteen Dream?
Velveteen Dream, thank you. Great minds think alike.
I mean, and a guy like Velveteen Dream has been a gimmick that has been in wrestling history for 70 years, since there was a wrestling history. You know, we talk about Gorgeous George being the first TV star in the late 40s. You know, it sounds like this Ricky Starr fella is cut from the same cloth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Velveteen Dream comparison is spot on. Velveteen Dream, the way he moves around the ring, that flamboyance, that larger-than-life persona, that's Ricky Starr in a nutshell. Ricky Starr is doing a lot of that.
And that sounds like wrestling in a nutshell.
Yeah,
Larger than life, flamboyant.
that might be the best way to put a capstone on his induction. Ricky Starr represents the transition from the old school of wrestling, where it's all about hooks and holes that can last for 80 minutes, to the new school of wrestling, where it's the personalities and the characters that drive the business. That, I think, is probably his epitaph in the wrestling business. He was a character first and a professional wrestler second. But
And
he represented the transition into what we now consider sports entertainment and pro wrestling today.
well said. Well, so I never even heard the name until today. So thank you for that. You talked me into him. I'd have to do a little bit of research, but I mean, I'm leaning that way.
And that's no disrespect to Johnny Saint. I mean, Johnny Saint could probably beat the snot out of me if he wanted to.
Oh, I'm sure he still could.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, he could get me today. So Johnny Saint, it's a crime and a travesty that you're not in the Hall of Fame, sir. But I think we all agree that your gig at NXT UK more than makes up for that slight.
Real quick, the most polarizing name on this section. Where are you on Big Daddy?
Okay.
Because I am a no on Big Daddy. I mean, he drew money, absolutely, for 8 years. Then the bottom fell out, and British wrestling was dead for 30 years until 2012. In part because Big Daddy was at the top of the card for as long as he was.
I'm gonna compare Big Daddy to a contemporary wrestler, and maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. Maybe you won't. He reminds me like an old school version of a Grado or a Grotto. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I can't even. I've never even really watched him all that much. I can't even pronounce his name properly. But he's one of those individuals where you either like him or you don't. And if you don't, you think he's the worst thing that ever happened.
And I think that's a good comparison because Big Daddy was at the top longer than Grado, but he also grew stale, just like Grado has to a lesser extent in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and it's no disrespect to him as a performer. He found success, and more power to him. I mean, he lived the dream. But as a performer, not impressed, really. He was almost a gimmick more than he was a performer. I mean, he was one of his big things in the business was teaming with Haystacks Calhoun. Or not Haystacks Calhoun.
Giant Haystacks.
Giant Haystacks. Yeah, the Loch Ness. He was wrestling with Loch Ness. But Giant Haystacks Calhoun, same general principle. The guys that are just super heavyweights. They're not in-ring competitors so much as they are box office attractions.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, he was a draw, but he left the territory in pretty bad shape at the end. Because he was an old fat guy at the top of the card for as long as he was. So
yeah, I can't put him forward.
I can't put him forward either. There's zero case for in-ring. Zero case. He was not even an average in-ring worker. He was a bad in-ring worker. And so his entire case is predicated on drawing ability, which was significant for about 10 years, and then the bottom fell out hard.
Yeah, it's it's one thing to draw money, it's another thing to create a stable territory.
Yeah.
We're going to get into a modern wrestler who you could very, very easily use the same comparison here in a moment about, he was a big draw in the 80s, but his territory barely survived past his peak. And a lot of it goes hand in hand with the performer's ability to not only draw money for a company, but to help that company find sustained success. And Big Daddy, for better or worse, the company, pretty much collapsed after a time with him on top.
Yep.
And it is the way it is. So no disrespect to him as a person, but just not personally a fan, and not
you know who
really
he reminds me of in that regard? The original Sheik.
Ooh,
The original Sheik. Oh, the only difference is that for good or for ill, the original Sheik invented hardcore wrestling, and Big Daddy doesn't have that accolade to his credit.
well, Big Daddy invented bad wrestling tights, so I'll give him
True.
that.
True, but I mean, the original Sheik is the same way. I mean, by 1980, Detroit was a wasteland in terms of wrestling promotions.
Which is amazing. It's amazing considering how powerful Detroit used to be just a decade before.
But exactly. But I mean, you keep a guy top for too long, and that's what happens. Now, I'm not saying the original Sheik should be kicked out of the Hall of Fame. He absolutely deserves his spot. But Big Daddy is like a dollar store version of that.
Yeah, that sounds really harsh, but I would have to say that's probably accurate.
And the original Sheik was a better wrestler too.
Well, we don't want to mince words. The original Sheik, Eddie Farhat, absolutely a talented in-ring worker at his age.
Which, I mean, matters a great deal.
Yes. There's a difference between a character who can work and a character who gets lucky. Big Daddy, I think, is more of the latter. He was a character that got lucky in the right spot.
Yeah.
Whereas the Sheik, he actually had talent to back up what he was doing on top of the card. So.
Exactly.
Now I feel just like a jerk for making fun of Big Daddy. We got to pick out some people here to uplift.
Okay.
We gotta uplift.
Do you want to talk Japan or Mexico?
We could probably combine the two. I am not going to be very knowledgeable on many of the luchadors when we go into the Mexican talk.
I voted for one. Who did I vote for in this ballot? I'll tell you. Let me give you the number if my screensaver would work. Come on, computer. I voted for 3 people in the Mexico category.
Interesting. Okay. Well,
did you vote for any? And if so, how many did you vote for?
I have one candidate out of the Mexican category here that I did put forward, and this was in part because I've known about him since I was a fan in the 90s.
Okay. I imagine we have the same person then.
I think I'm almost 100%.
My 3 that I would like to highlight: L.A. Park / La Parka, Dr. Wagner Jr.
Yep.
And the original Caristico.
Did you really?
I did. I did vote for the. I did put the Mystico on my ballot, and let me tell you why. I'm gonna name a name that you're gonna love.
Okay.
Mr. Red Sox fan. Pedro Martinez.
Yes, sir.
Pedro Martinez had 5 unbelievable years. The last year in Montreal, the first 4 years in Boston. Then he had a little bit of shoulder fatigue in 2001. Came back a lesser but still good pitcher. 2003, 2002, 3, 4, 5. Went to the Mets and kind of finished up his career that way, right? But for those 5 years, he was the Dominican Sandy Koufax. Shit, Sandy Koufax was the white Pedro Martinez. So
my baseball spider sense here is just tingling.
It was not a long run for Mystico, but in CMLL, the asses he put in seats and the way he did it, and yes, he flamed out in the WWE. He absolutely did, but he came back and he rehabilitated, and he's back at the upper mid part of the card, and he's still getting pops and he's still selling masks. But for that run that he had in 03, 04, 05, 06, 07, give or take, that's his Pedro Martinez run. His star shone brightly enough to overcome everything else.
I love you right now. That baseball reference just makes me. It gives me such a warm, fuzzy feeling because I understand exactly where you're coming from with that. It's an absolute home run of a reference there, and I could buy that actually. Honestly, I could buy that. Now, what I want from you is to go into LA Park, La Parka here, because if you're a longtime fan, obviously La Parka is very familiar to old WCW fans. Nobody strums a chair like he did. But talk a little bit, if you could, about his career in the business and why he's more than just that oversized gimmick that we saw in WCW.
I mean, let's talk about the fact that he main evented Triple Mania in the year of our Lord 2018 and was the most over guy in the match in 2018. This fat guy in a skeleton suit was so over and so popular, you know? He was in this Triple Mania match against Psycho Clown, who's their version of John Cena in terms of the babyface the kids love, King Cuerno / Phantasma, and Pentagon Jr., who needs no introduction. And he was the most over guy in the match with those three guys. And he's over no matter where he goes. He's so over that CMLL, who hates everybody, was willing to work with him. And that doesn't take into you either have it or you don't, Biff. You either have that charisma or you don't. And he's got it oozing out of every pore on his ample body.
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting because you look at someone who's had the longevity that he has, and that's really a staple of the top Mexican performers in CMLL and AAA. You know, you have almost, I would like to say, something of a meritocracy in the major promotions in Mexico, where if you are a successful performer, your career peak will extend much further in Mexico than it would anywhere else in the world, even more so than Japan. You know, Japan have the old lions, your Yuji Nagatas and your Jushin Ligers that still have a place on the card into their 50s, but they're not considered, you know, the peak of the business in Japan. You know, there's a certain, you know, niche for them on the card, and there's a place for them, but they're not considered like the top of the card. In Mexico, some of their biggest draws can be, you know, substantial stars into their 40s and 50s. It's just a different culture. It's almost, wrestling has a deeper and more profound respect. If you're a star in Mexico, you are a star for a long time. And I think that's what we see here with LA Park. You know, he's so much more than the middle tier cruiserweight from WCW. He really did forge himself a legendary career. And I didn't put him forward on my ballot, but it was close. He was very close. But talk a little bit about Dr. Wagner Jr. This was the one that we both had. And I'm interested to get your take on it because I knew of Wagner Jr. Going back into the mid-'90s in the Super Junior scene over in Japan.
Absolutely. But for me, what put it over the top is that he's been drawing without the mask as Ray Wagner. However, he lost the mask to Psycho Clown a year ago in 2017. And I thought, okay, that's going to be it for Dr. Wagner. He's going to kind of transition to a lesser role, you know, kind of like one of the Villanos did after he lost his mask in 2000, you know, kind of shuffle on down the card. But he's still out there in his singlet and his brown mink coat, you know, putting asses in seats. So that counts for me. Not to mention he's been a champion all over the world, AAA, CMLL, NWA, you know, IWGP Junior Heavyweight. Like, no matter where, this guy's been a champion everywhere. He's put bodies in seats, which, again, the name of the game, right? Yep. His in-ring work is still good, despite having no knees and being north of 50. I think he's a no-brainer.
I think he might be a drawing card for Thursday's draft, the 2001 Sport Draft.
I imagine we will say his name sooner or later.
I think he's going to be called sooner rather than later. But you know what? I'm just going to echo everything you said because he's someone that I was introduced to during my days tape trading in the 90s. Those were good. And if people today, like, no disrespect to young fans, I'm so glad that you found your fandom in the business. You don't know the joy of getting your tapes in the mail, whether you were trading with people on the message boards, whether you had a distributor like Golden Boy Tapes that used to be my go-to.
My favorite were the comp tapes.
Yes, absolutely.
You get a comp tape, like, ooh, Kenta Kobashi, 4 hours of Kenta Kobashi, great.
There was, there were companies that just put together like 5 cassette packages of the best of Japanese wrestling in X year. And it would just go tape by tape. New Japan, All Japan, FMW,
and it would be like a random half-an-hour TV show, like recorded. Yeah. Do you remember when you had to? This happened to me a lot. I would go to a Japanese supermarket, and I would get lucky, and I would get like TV. And they would sometimes, this Japanese supermarket would have VHSs of Japanese TV shows, that they would sell to people who just came over from Japan who wanted to watch, Japanese TV shows. And every now and again, you'd get lucky and there'd be like 2 episodes of NJPW TV. And you're like, yes, I'm buying this. And the guy or lady up front would be like, why are you buying that? I don't care. I want to see Shinya Hashimoto beat the shit out of someone. That's why I'm buying this. Those were the tape trading days that I remember.
I am so glad that you brought up the market, because I have a story to tell you, and believe it or not, that ties into one of the names in the Japanese wrestlers that I'm putting forward. When I was younger, and I'm not trying to pick on myself, this is just, I wasn't old enough. I was only like 5 or 6. I understood the concept of people immigrating from East Asia, but I wasn't able at 5 or 6 to distinguish between Japanese and Vietnamese and Laotian. And this is a long way of saying I went into the market one day. We had a very strong Laotian community of immigrants that had moved to our community after the Vietnam War. And the church that I was in at the time, we were taking part in kind of an outreach program. We were kind of helping them get some different stuff built up. We used to go on the weekends, work with Habitat for Humanity, and we would, just help, furnish houses and everything. And so the communities of the Laotian church and our church kind of came together. And so we would always go into the market and just, look at some of the stuff that they had there that you're not going to find at a Food Line or a Milo. But they had a picture up. It was like one of those old cutouts. You know how you used to get the magazines where they'd have like the folding posters that you could pull out and put up on your wall and everything?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I wasn't a fan of Japanese wrestling at the time. But apparently this couple that owned this, ethnic market were. And they had a picture of a wrestler up in their window as like a little advert. And I didn't know him at the time. But years later, after that store had closed down, I actually went back down to the little shopping center. And then I live in a very depressed neighborhood. So I've still got like gas stations from the 1970s that look like freaking time machines. Okay. They haven't been touched. They're just left to rot out in my depressed little neighborhood where all the mills have gone and everything. This little strip market has pretty much been abandoned, and I don't know whatever happened to the people that own the store, but they still had some of the adverts up on the wall. And one of the wrestlers' pictures was still up. And it's so weird that you brought up that story about the market, because that was the first time that I had ever seen a picture of Hayabusa.
Nice.
Hayabusa's picture. Now, I don't know how they became fans. I don't know. Maybe Hayabusa was involved in some sort of marketing campaign. I don't know. But that was the first time that I ever saw his face. And I did not see him again until I started watching ECW. And he came over and he had an appearance. And it was one of those, where do I know that guy's face from? Where have I seen that guy before? The market, of course. He's the guy in the market. And that was, just such a random little thing that shows you, no matter where you go, wrestling seems to find you.
It really does. That's a cool story.
It's a warm bit of nostalgia for me because I used to love going into that little shop.
My buddy and I, when we were 17, just got our driver's license, we would go to the Japanese market every Friday because he would get his anime, and I would straight from Japan, and I would hope and pray that, oh yes, a new episode of All Japan TV. Sweet. I get to watch Mitsuhara and Kobashi again, but it doesn't matter because it's going to be great,
So he got Outlaw Star and you got All Japan Pro Wrestling.
Exactly, or whatever. Oh, cool, an old FMW from 1994. Yeah, I'll watch this, God,
those were the days.
So,
oh, those were the days.
Any Mexican you wanted to highlight?
Dr. Wagner Jr. was the one name above all others that I put forward on my ballot, and that's no disrespect to your Ultimate Guerreros or Blue Panthers. Obviously, there's a lot of wrestling history in that list, and I obviously, as an old WCW fan, I'm always going to be partial to La Parka.
I think he's a no-brainer. I mean, he's such an influence that CMLL even does business with his son.
I'm close. I'm very close on him, and I'm still thinking about it. I had to put Dr. Wagner Jr. in there because Dr. Wagner Jr. I just have so much more experience with him with those tape trading because he was not just a big star in Mexico, but he had a big presence in Japan as well. And I was never a huge Lucha Libre fan, but I was a big fan of the Japanese wrestling scene, especially the Super Junior scene of the mid-'90s to the late '90s.
Yeah, you mentioned your favorite match is a Super Juniors match.
Yeah, well, to this day, I've seen, however many wrestling shows, hundreds, thousands, and I wouldn't trade the '94 J Cup for anything. So.
Yeah, it's damn good. Segue, Japanese candidates.
This one's going to be tough.
Let me say my piece real quick, not about the candidates, but about the process. This is where I say the age 35 is too young, and it really should be the age of 40.
Agreed.
Because there are 3 names on this list who don't deserve being on this ballot, not because they are not talented, and all 3 of them are, but because they have not finished their legacy yet, or even started their legacy yet, in the case of one of these names.
Yeah.
And I'm referring to Kenny Omega, Kota Ibushi, and Tetsuya Naito. Kenny Omega, you can at least say, well, he's the IWGP champion. He should be on the ballot. He's 35. Tetsuya Naito has not even started his run yet that he will eventually have. 35 is too young. But, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. And this is the army we have. So, any Jap, you like that, don't you?
That's your stock is rising. Number 2.
I mean, it's say what you will. It's a great quote.
I completely.
God knows I have, but that's a great quote.
I completely agree with you. It's a perfect quote for this.
There is one name on this ballot I voted for.
You put one name forward.
And if you who I voted for, and it is not the 3 guys I listed previously. Okay. And I love all 3. Love all 3. And if you listen to my show last Thursday, you'll have a clue as to who I voted for. So, did you vote for anybody in this Japanese category?
I had 2, and this was by far outside of the wrestling non-wrestlers and the current wrestlers. This was the toughest category.
Okay.
Because there is a case that I could make if you give me enough time for Jun Akiyama, for Tenzan, especially Tenzan.
For Tenkozy.
Yeah, you can make a case for Akira Tao, even Sema to an extent. Maybe not as much.
I love Shima, but I couldn't quite pull the trigger on him.
I couldn't either. I got close, but it came down really to two names for me. And I'm with you on Ibushi and Omega and Naito. They're going to get there one day, but I would like to see what their legacy is before I crown them.
Agreed.
Now, one of the names I mentioned earlier, Hayabusa. This is very much a vanity pick for me. It's a personal pick. He was a personal favorite, but he was such a revolutionary performer, and I would argue probably one of the biggest junior heavyweight stars of the 1990s to have not really come through the New Japan system. Like, there's three real big pipelines for Super J style, that Super J Cup era of talent in the junior heavyweight ranks. You had the people that came up through New Japan, which those are your Jushin Ligers, your Wild Pegasus.
Ghetto.
You have your Michinoku Pro guys. These are the individuals who, your great Sasuke's, your Takas. They were absolutely pivotal with companies like Michinoku Pro, Dragon Gate later on. And then you had those that were almost freelancers. You know, we talked today about how Kota Ibushi is kind of a freelancer in Japan. That's really kind of what Hayabusa was. He would wrestle a little bit for FMW. He had a lot of success with FMW. He had, a lot of success with the wrestling romance promotion, War, as I like to call it. Of course, he made a name for himself in these tournaments, which that's what I love about some of the Super Junior tournaments that they had during this era, where they would bring in people from different promotions. There was a little bit of a cooperation there. Even though Jushin Liger won the second tournament, spoiler, because the Booker man always goes over in the end. There's always this aura of cooperation between all of the companies bringing in their big talent. But Hayabusa, for me, he drew money. He was a big star. More than anything else, I think he was an innovator. He was one of the wrestlers that really brought the junior heavyweight style into the 90s. And he kind of blended that Japanese style with the Lucha Libre style. Now, we could argue that wound up being kind of disastrous for him personally because he had his accident in the ring. And you could argue maybe the style was too dangerous. I don't know. Accidents happen.
And I don't. His injury was suffered on a moonsault. It wasn't suffered on a moonsault jumping through a table that was set on fire.
Right.
It was just no different than what the hell's his name? The Mexican wrestler who died a few years ago. Oh shit. Perro Aguayo.
Yeah.
Perro Aguayo Jr. I mean, that was a move that's been done hundreds of times.
Right. So it'd
be one thing if God forbid he got hit in the head with a light tube and that killed him.
Yeah.
Then you can make the case that the danger of the business killed him. But that's not what happened to Hayabusa.
Last C4 explosion went wrong.
Yeah, exactly. That's not what happened to
Right. He slipped on the middle road, but it was just an unfortunate accident.
It's a move that Chris Jericho has done 500,000 times.
Exactly. It's the exact. That's what injured him. He botched the lion saw basically. Landed on his head. So
that Chris Jericho has done in every match for the past 30 years.
Yeah.
It's tragedy, but it's not because of the dangers of professional wrestling.
Right.
Any more inherent than the dangers that are already in professional wrestling when you step in folks regardless.
That's it right there. It's nothing more than the danger that all professional wrestlers take upon themselves when they get into the ring.
Exactly. So that's your two. Who is it again? I'm sorry.
Hayabusa's one, and that one is a borderline because his career was cut so short. But I put him in just because of a personal preference. The other one I think is a little bit more stable, and that's Yuji Nagata. Yuji Nagata did not have a very memorable run in the United States when he was working in WCW. He never really got above the lower mid-card. But he was a very prominent member of the New Japan roster in the 90s and 2000s. We're talking about someone in Nagata, former IWGP heavyweight champion, kind of helmed the company for a number of years. It's interesting. He kind of got sandwiched right in there with the last years of Inoki's leadership when Inoki kind of went off the deep end. But, to this day, Nagata still has a lot of respect in the company. He's one of those mentor figures that still has a place on the card. And he's one of the best mentor figures on the card. Some of those matches that he has at the New Year's shows with the Young Lions are some of the best of the year in terms of tag team wrestlers. His
2017 G1 was great.
Yeah.
At the age of 46 or whatever he is, or was at the time,
Yeah, if you only know Yuji Nagata from his time in WCW, you are doing yourself a grand disservice. You need to go find his work in New Japan, in particular over the last 15 to 20 years, because he has been every bit as important to that company in his own era that Hiroshi Tanahashi was in his, to what Okada and Naito and Omega are to theirs. Nagata is very much, an important player in that company's history. And, he drew money for them. He was really one of the last big draws they had before things kind of petered out on them. And then Tanahashi came along and kind of resurrected everything. And so, Nagata is definitely of that old school right before New Japan kind of became what it is today.
Yeah, he's that last vanguard.
There you go. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. He's the last vanguard of the classic New Japan heavyweights from the 80s and 90s. And then we get into the era of Hiroshi Tanahashi and Okada.
And we're off to the races.
And there you go. So, yeah, I put Nagata in there. Hayabusa is very much just a personal preference type pick.
Go on.
No, that's what I was. Those are the two. You could probably convince me to put Hayabusa off the list. Nagata is the one that I would say comfortably above all others probably deserves to be in.
I came close on Nagata. I couldn't quite pull the trigger. I'm pretty conservative when it comes down to it. In terms of the voting, that's why I only had 9 spaces instead of the full 10. I mean, to me, if you're a bubble candidate, I'm going to default to no instead of default to yes. But I love Yuji Nagata, so I won't lose any sleep over him. My yes is Jun Akiyama.
Yeah.
And I talked a little bit about him on Thursday when we did the draft, and I made him my booker. I thought he was a borderline to yes candidate just for his 90s All Japan and 2000s Noah. And then when he came back to All Japan in 2013-14 and he took the book in 2015, and now the company's doing pretty well. They're selling out Korakuen Hall, which for them was no sure thing beforehand.
Yeah, that's true.
You talk about making a guy like Joe Doring. You talk about making a guy like Zeus in The Bodyguard. You talk about making stars. I think it's fairly safe to say that they are a strong number 3 in Japan behind New Japan and DDT, which before he took over, they were in the grave. They were in the wrestling grave. So I think that is enough puts him gets him over the top, for my opinion.
Yeah, the only reason that I did not include him on mine, and this is purely where we get into that area of what you've seen and what you haven't seen. I just haven't seen enough of him in Pro Wrestling Noah to be able to justify picking him on my ballot. But everything you said, 150% agreement of what he's done with All Japan and helping bring that brand back into some level of prominence, which is much deserved, by the way. It would be a very sad sight indeed if we lost All Japan, considering the history of that brand and what they've contributed to our personal fandoms over the years. So I'm glad to see what his work has accomplished there with them. Absolutely very much a transcendent talent, former Triple Crown heavyweight champion, which you and I both know being All Japan marks from the 90s, I'm sure. That Triple Crown heavyweight championship, that was the preeminent title in wrestling fandom for a long stretch of time. That probably, the Triple Crown championship was in the 90s what the IWGP championship would be today. Kind of the gold standard for talent and just pure in-ring work rate and ability among the heavyweights. So, he's one of those guys that you could easily talk me into. So, great pick there. Very good pick. But that was a tough category.
It was. I was close on Shima. Dragon Gate's been a healthy promotion for a long, long time, and Shima was always the top guy or one of the top guys. His influence on that Dragon Gate roster, and is memorable. And Dragon Gate's is a little more important than people give it credit for. We talked about Pac on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
I think that he's one of the kings of the high spot, which is kind of how wrestling has evolved into. I couldn't quite pull the trigger on him yet, but I reserve the right to change my mind in 2 years or 3 years or whenever, So
he was one of the performers that I had a chance to see and didn't take advantage of in 2008. Ring of Honor had some Dragon Gate performers come for a super show down WrestleMania weekend. This would be during WrestleMania 24 back in 2008, and I had tickets to all their shows.
Nice.
And I didn't go because I'm an idiot. So I missed out. I missed out on seeing him that time, unfortunately. But there again, another name, kind of a blast from the past. It's the Japanese wrestling scene. When you're talking about junior heavyweight performers, we're talking about the heavyweight scene of All Japan or the hardcore scene of the 90s. It's just such a diverse, Joshi Puro for that matter. It's just such a diverse place. There are so many different promotions that you could lose yourself in. Like, there's a reason that we are such big fans of Japanese wrestling.
Yep.
If you've never, and now with it more accessible than ever, so many different promotions have their own streaming services. Pro Wrestling Noah has a service now. Dragon Gate, I think they have a new service that they've implemented. Of course, you've got New Japan World. All Japan's got a service now. Stardom has a service. So, I mean, it's like there's so many different ways you can get into it. If there's one thing you could take away from this episode, Japanese wrestling, and especially Lucha Libre wrestling in Mexico right now, too, there's just so much great wrestling out there. You owe it to yourself to expand your horizons because there's just some amazing talent and an amazing assortment of promotions that have a rich and wonderful history that we could talk for hours about. We really could.
Go on.
No, I'm about to transition out of that. We've got so much that we could say, but we do have another candidate class here.
Well, two.
That's true. We got the modern performers and we got the non-wrestling personalities.
You want to do the modern performers?
Yeah, we might as well. It's as good as time as any because this is where we're going to get into the controversy, I think. This is going to be the tough one.
Who are your guys that you picked? How many did you pick?
Out of this category, now I'm going to cheat here a little bit because they were grouped as one, as a tag team. I'm not counting them as individual inductees.
No, they are as a tag team, so they should be voted on as their contributions only as the tag team.
Right, and that would be the team of Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson. Now, this is a very, very tricky one. And I'll go over the other three names. I do have three other names on the list.
You have four total. I have four as well.
The only drawback to choosing Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson as a tag team is their candidacy is very much biased by their singles runs and their other work. Arn Anderson had a great tag team run with Ole Anderson as the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. Arn Anderson did a lot of great work as the Enforcer and the Dangerous Alliance and the Four Horsemen. So that colors that a lot. Tully Blanchard, I love his work with Gino Hernandez down in Southwest Championship Wrestling. But if we're talking about money drawing tag teams, despite the fact that they didn't have the longevity that you're probably looking for in an inductee, because their peak was only from about 1986 to 1989, when Arn Anderson went back to WCW and Tully Blanchard retired. So you're only looking at a 3 or 4 year run here where they're tagging up. But they drew so much money in both the WWF and Jim Crockett Promotions. They drew 2 different places in 2 different completely styles. 2 completely different styles of pro wrestling in the 80s. You know, from Crockett in the South, the Carolina style, then you go up north to New York, WWF style. And they drew money in both places. And were significant players, main event players in both companies. I had to pick them. I just can't not see them in the Hall of Fame. They deserve it. They belong there. And frankly, I'm shocked that they're not already in.
Okay.
And so I'm rectifying that. That's one of the 4.
Who are your other 3?
The other 3,
I'll go through my 4.
Sergeant Slaughter, much more comfortable with that one. He has the longevity. Very memorable in-ring persona. He has the accolades. He drew money. He was a very good wrestler for his size, especially. One of the underrated big men in the business, which, you know, he's not like the size of a Vader, but he's no small potatoes either. So very solid worker, very long, very prosperous career. Had a lot of crossover appeal with the G.I. Joe sponsorship. It kind of turned him into a little pop culture icon there in the 80s. And so he's got kind of the nostalgia factor working for him. I really didn't think Sergeant Slaughter was too tough a choice. Third choice out of the modern performers, this is another name that I'm surprised has not already been in. Sylvester Ritter, the Junkyard Dog. Junkyard Dog did in the Southern Territories, particularly around the Gulf Coast region and especially Mid-South, the impossible. He proved that a black wrestler could not only be a star, but could be your top babyface star. Like, we're talking about the Deep South, less than a decade after the end of segregation and Jim Crow. And the absolute love, the fierce, loyal devotion that those Southern crowds had for the Junkyard Dog. I mean, you will never convince me the Junkyard Dog did not have a major role in helping the South heal in the places that he worked. You never convince me he didn't have a role in healing some of the strife between the people of the South after the whole segregation, crisis in the 50s and 60s. He was a healing influence on that region. People loved that man to death, to the point where they almost murdered Michael P.S. Hayes just to protect him. Famous story of Junkyard Dog when he was blinded by Michael Hayes. And Hayes is going to come after Junkyard Dog, who's blind. He's pretending he can't see. A guy jumps over the barricade with a gun, says, "Don't worry, dog, I got him." And Junkyard Dog is sitting there pondering what he needs to do. He can either disarm the man and save Michael Hayes' life, but then prove that he could see, and the fans will be heartbroken, or he could let the guy murder Michael P.S. Hayes and keep kayfabe alive. And it's like, he's actually struggling with that because that's how over he was. I mean, if you're popular enough where somebody is jumping barricades with pistols to protect you, you are damn popular. And the fact that a black man could make that much of an impact, become that much of a star, be that beloved in that era, is a testament to how good he was, to how charismatic, and he used to go in the ring. A lot of people base Junkyard Dog off the end of his career when he was broken down and had problems with drugs and alcohol. Early JYD, he could move in the ring. He was a tremendous professional wrestler. He drew truckloads of money all over the South. He was a cultural institution in Louisiana and Mississippi for years and years. Junkyard Dog is a no-brainer for me. I can't believe he's not already in. It's got to be that recency bias of the way his career ended, I guess, that's kept him out. But I put Dog in, Slaughter, Blanchard, Anderson with J.J. Dillon. The last choice, CM Punk. Controversial pick maybe, but CM Punk, he drew. He had more than a decade of high-level runs between Ring of Honor and the WWE. So, yeah, I went CM Punk on that one as well. If no other reason, he has crossover appeal. He was one of the progenitors of the new style that has taken over WWE in the last 10 years. So I think that he probably could qualify too.
We share 2 of the 4 names.
Okay.
Sergeant Slaughter and CM Punk.
Okay.
Everything you said about those 2, I co-sign.
All right.
I think in terms of Punk, you have a guy who headlined multiple pay-per-views, drew money, good worker, good promo, and you said, you alluded to it, was instrumental in getting indie guys a foot in the door in the WWE.
Yeah.
Without CM Punk, there's no Sami Zayn or Bryan Danielson or Kevin Steen or whomever, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
They're those guys are still working, quote-unquote, bingo halls.
There's no NXT as we know it today.
No, not at all. Hunter's Vanity Fed, as I like to call it. It does not exist. 2 more names for you. You ready?
Go for it.
Samoa Joe. He was a great worker until he decided to take a bump on his back on a staircase in a match against Sting, and then he got sucked into the TNA vortex, which I will not hold against him. I'm not punishing the guy because he couldn't get over and because he couldn't make Dixie Carter and Hulk Hogan work, you know? But you talked about CM Punk. You can't talk about CM Punk without Samoa Joe. And it's pretty clear now that he is revitalized in NXT and WWE that the guy still can absolutely bring it. He's one of the best promos I've ever heard, and that's instrumental in drawing people into buildings. He's headlined multiple shows in NXT, house shows and takeovers that have drawn record crowds at the time, you know? Mm-hmm. And I would say from 2004 to about 2008, he was one of the best workers in the world in terms of in-ring ability until he got hurt. And my last name is a no-brainer to me, and that's Edge. I think he's a great worker, good promo, wonderful character work, great in tags, great in singles, main evented at WrestleMania, moved the needle when he had chances as champion, was John Cena's greatest rival, who John Cena was only his generation's biggest star, so that says something. He had great matches with a whole bunch of guys, was part of the TLC era of tag teams, for good or for ill, popularized ladder matches and table matches. You know, the guy was a proven difference maker time and again when it came time to move the needle. He was given the championship as a 1-month storyline to get it off Cena, moved the needle so they kept it on him. You notice how as soon as he retired, the brand split pretty much went away?
That is true.
Because after he retired, they tried to give the belt to Del Rio and ratings tanked. They tried to give the belt to Orton's and ratings tanked. Edge was the life jacket holding SmackDown's head above water for 2 years, from 2009 to 2011. He's had a litany of great matches with a litany of guys, and I can only imagine how much hotter he would be if Triple H didn't need to move to Friday nights.
You know something? We talked about this with Randy Orton before we went on the air,
mm-hmm.
and you have almost convinced me to swap my vote for Blanchard and Anderson to Edge. The problem that I have with Edge, and I would like to preface this by saying Edge is one of my favorite wrestlers of the decade. I was a huge fan of Edge Edge's going back to when he first debuted in the WWF. So I kind of watched his entire career unfold as it happened. The reason that I didn't choose Edge originally is because to me, he fell into the Randy Orton category of someone that should have been bigger than he was. But in Edge's case, I think it was his career got cut short by injuries. And it was the injuries that kept him from getting where he should have been. Whereas Orton's was more of he didn't have that extra gear.
I'll go on. And then I'm going to ask you a question.
Well, this is the question you're about to ask may tie into what I was just about to say.
Go for it.
I am on the fence, though, as far as Edge goes. Because while I think that he didn't get the run he should have gotten, and it makes me undervalue the run that he did get as a result, I cannot sit here and say that he did not have a memorable impact on the business. Whether it was the transcendent tag team rivalry with the Hardys and the Dudleys, that kind of served as really the last great epoch in tag team wrestling, I think, in the WWF/WWE. So he's got that working for him. He had a very memorable main event run. I dispute very, very mildly that he was John Cena's greatest rival. I think CM Punk has supplanted him in that role, but Edge is absolutely number 2. I think Edge's feud with The Undertaker was bigger in hindsight than his feud with Cena was. But, again, that's just pure nitpicking. I think if Edge had been able to wrestle another 2 or 3 years at the level he was working between 2008 and 2011, he would have been a no-brainer for me. I think it was the combination of how much time he lost due to injury early on in his career because he had the neck fusion surgery, and then he lost some time at the end of his career when he had to retire early because of the MRI results. That's the only reason that I'm not harder on the case for Edge. But I could probably be swayed because right now I'm swaying heavily.
Yeah, I mean,
on him.
I understand what you're saying. I think he's pretty close to a lock. Like, let me ask you this question. We talk about Randy Orton, and I want to preface this by saying that I am one of the few people who is a fan of Randy Orton's in-ring style. There are not a lot of people who like Randy Orton, the in-ring wrestler. I do. So I know that I'm coming from that place. If Randy Orton never entered a ring, wrestling would more or less be the same now as it, right? Would more or less be the same.
I would consider that to be mostly true. Yeah.
If Edge never entered a ring, wrestling would be different. For good or for ill, he redefined the ladder match in both style and frequency, and he was one of the pioneers of the massive high spot style that, again, for good or for ill, is all over the place in both the WWE, Japan, Mexico, wherever it is. So,
you know what? You convinced me. Yeah, I'm gonna put Edge on there. I think on my list as well. I'm gonna take Blanchard and Anderson off. No disrespect to them. If we were just talking individual candidacies in Blanchard and Anderson, they would absolutely be on my list. As a tag team, I just don't think they were around long enough. But Edge, you convinced me. I'm going to go with Edge on my ballot as well.
My work here is done, my friend.
Well, I gave you Ricky Starr and you gave me Edge.
So I'm looking forward to learning about this Ricky Starr fella.
It's a fair trade. It's a fair trade.
Which is kind of why I love this show, you know, to be honest.
Yeah, and I want to just echo something that you were saying too about the Randy Orton business. You know, Randy Orton is. We're not being disrespectful to Randy Orton when we don't include him in this group. It's just that Randy Orton felt like he was going to be a huge deal in 2004 when he was having those matches with Mick Foley, and he was getting ready to elevate up to the world title level, but he just never found that next level.
09 was going to be his year.
He got close.
He got very close, and then he
Yeah.
got Triple H'd.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that's
he seemed to have that problem a lot
yep,
in his career. He always ran up into a buzzsaw.
yep.
Generally, it was Triple H, and he ran into the Mark Henry buzzsaw in 2011. So, but be that as it were, no disrespect to Randy Orton, but I just don't value Orton's career compared to that of Edge's. And
I mean,
Edge was borderline for me until tonight, and you pushed me over the
Orton
edge.
has three. To me, Orton, and again, I am a fan of Randy Orton, the wrestler, and a lot of people are not. And I'm not alone on that island, but that island is pretty sparsely populated. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Orton has three attributes going for him. One, he looks great. He's tall, he fills out well, looks good in the suit, and that matters. Two, he's got a really, really, really awesome finish. And three, he's been pushed as a main eventer for 15 years. But that last one doesn't matter. You know?
Yeah.
He's been pushed as a main eventer for 15 years. This isn't the Hall of Fame of guys who've gotten sustained pushes. Again, if Randy Orton never quit the Marines and he retired after his 20 years in the Marine Corps and went to have a wife and kids and, ran a gym, wrestling history is not substantially different one way or the other. And that matters to me. If Junkyard Dog was never in wrestling history, it's a much different business. Sergeant Slaughter was never in wrestling history. It's a much different business. If Edge or Mystico or Jun Akiyama or whomever was never in wrestling history, it's a much different business. But if Randy Orton's in wrestling business, we don't have a cool internet meme. Okay, so what? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I buy into that, and that makes a lot of sense to me, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't put Orton on my list of people to put through forward. But I think we're pretty much in line with Punk and Slaughter.
We are.
And then Edge here, we both come around on Edge.
Who are your 5 non-wrestlers that you could pick?
Okay, this one is hard as hell because
it is hard. I had about 7 and I narrowed it down to 5.
This was tough getting it down to 5, but I did get down to 5 here. Bill Apter was a no-brainer for me. Just what he's meant to the business in terms of Pro Wrestling Illustrated and how influential that has been, even from a kayfabe sense. Bill Apter is the kayfabe version of Dave Meltzer. And he's been doing this for 30 plus years. He's gotten some recognition both from WWF, the WWE, and from the other companies. Had to include him on my 5. Jim Crockett Jr., I put him in over his father. His father was an influential promoter in the Carolinas for a long time. Jim Crockett Jr. took that company national and would have succeeded had they not advanced too quickly. He picked the wrong war with Vince, and he basically bled himself dry before he could get established. If they had been just a little bit more patient, the wrestling landscape would be dramatically different today. There would still be a Jim Crockett Promotions in some capacity in the wrestling business. That's how dynamite hot that company was. And so the fact that he's not in already, I had to put him on there. Howard Finkel, greatest ring announcer of all time. That's one of those aesthetic touches that just made WWF programming so good over the years, to have a legendary voice as your ring announcer. And Howard Finkel, one of the all-time great guys in the business too, company historian for the WWE, very prominent member of the WWE family. And then I took the 2 managers, Gary Hart and Jimmy Hart. Gary Hart for his work in Texas and Florida. Of course, Gary directly responsible for one of the all-time biggest baby faces in the history of pro wrestling. Instrumental in turning Dusty Rhodes babyface at the Paxton Nam angle. He was a prominent manager in the NWA territories throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Survived that horrific plane crash in Tampa that killed Buddy Shane. And so, or Bobby Shane, not Buddy Shane, apologies. But, he managed to continue on after that. A very prominent voice of World Class back in the Crockett and early era WCW on TBS in 89 and 90. So Gary Hart, put him in there, and Jimmy Hart. You know, he had a very long career. He was a very prosperous manager in the WWF and WCW. He still works for the WWE as kind of an ambassador type figure today. His work in Memphis was revolutionary. He was one of the great all-time manager runs is Jimmy Hart's first family down in Memphis. If you've ever gotten a chance to see what Jimmy Hart could do with guys like Jerry Lawler down there, it was transcendent level work. That's why he got hired in New York. He was that good in Memphis over that 3 to 5 year stretch. So Jimmy Hart, Gary Hart, Howard Finkel, Jim Crockett Jr., and Bill Apter. Those were my 5. Who were the 5 that you ended up going with?
Jimmy Hart, to me, an absolute no-brainer. I'm shocked he's not already in for the reasons that you listed.
Agreed. Yeah.
If you said, George, I think Jimmy Hart is the best manager of all time, I would disagree slightly, but I would respect your opinion.
He's in the conversation.
That's not a hot take. You know, people like to say that's a hot take. That's not a hot take. I went both Crockett's, actually.
Okay.
I went both Crockett's. Junior, for the reason you listed, and people say, oh, well, you know, he lost. But yeah, but he lost to Vince. Everyone lost to Vince.
Everyone lost to Vince.
But you know what? It took some big fucking brass ones to go after Vince the way Junior did. So I'm going to respect that.
Yeah.
And Senior, I mean, I'm talking to a guy who's from Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't need to tell you about Jim Crockett Sr. He built that territory from the ground up, and he ran it for, what, 30 years?
30 to 40, yeah.
Yeah. So I went with both of them. I went Don Owen. And I've been a big Don Owen guy for the past 4 or 5 years. I think it's tough running a territory that's so geographically isolated in Portland. He ran it for 45 years, from 1950 to 1990. He never went out over his skis. The boys loved him. They loved working for him. He drew well on TV. He always drew big crowds. He lasted a lot longer than his contemporaries. I think he was running until 1991. And there's that steadiness is something that I appreciate, especially in a place like Portland where it was not easy to get to in the era of early air travel, where you're flying connecting flights and you're sitting in coach and etc. You know,
yeah.
Before the luxuries we take air travel, and dovetailing with Jimmy Hart, I went with Jerry Jarrett. Not a Hall of Fame of good guys, but a Hall of Fame. He ran that Memphis territory for a long time, and he was a revolutionary booker. Some of the stuff that we love in professional wrestling today, the crowd brawls, the Andy Kaufman stuff, is Jerry Jarrett. So those are my 5.
And not a bad 5 out of the lot. You can make a case for your 5. We had some crossover. The names that we didn't share, we each make a case for them. We could make cases for some of the names that didn't get appropriated. Lord James Blears had.
I think there's a great case for George Scott.
George Scott has a case, and I'm so glad that you mentioned Don Owen. Don Owen and Paul Bosch are 2 promoters from the territorial era that do not get nearly the amount of love and respect that they deserve today, because there's so little remaining of Houston wrestling and Portland wrestling. But Don Owen and Paul Bosch in particular were 2 men that really did the best they could with what they had available, and the result was 2 of the best territories in their own unique ways. Portland is that little outpost in the Northwest, back in an era before, transportation made it easier to get out that way. And then, down in Houston, basically homesteading a city for however many years Paul Bosch worked. Those 2 guys in their own respective territories deserve way more respect. So kudos to you, sir, for the Don Owen love. Kudos on the Jerry Jarrett love as well. Absolutely agree.
Gary Hart was a good shout, by the way. Thank you for bringing him up. One of the legendary managers.
It's just, you can look at this list and Dave Brown, legendary commentator with Lance Russell. You've got George Scott, who, as you mentioned, the strong case for. He was very prominent in the Carolinas in the 70s, and then
how about Larry Maddox in St. Louis?
There's just you could go so many different ways on the non-wrestlers. That was probably the toughest.
It was very tough.
It came down to basically, my love of PWI over the years and my love of Howard Finkel's announcing. That's the only two reasons that I could justify getting them in there. But honestly, every single person on that list, more so than the other lists of the categories, you could almost make a case for every one of them. So,
well said.
It was a tough endeavor, but it was a fun endeavor.
Mr. Kensington, this was a hell of a show. We should do this again sometime.
You know what, we really should. And this is something that we talked about, the Connoisseurs as a group. We know we brought this up in the past. We're not just about our weekly shows. We have so much that we want to do with this channel. So many different ideas. We've talked about doing personal interviews with each connoisseur about their personal fandom and what they're bringing to the table, why they got into watching wrestling. This idea has kind of been ruminating for a couple of weeks that we wanted to do. We've talked in the past about doing little mini shows on different promotions. There's an outstanding invitation to Greg the Hold, a.k.a. number 5 from the Grounds for Development show, whenever we talk about Stampede Wrestling. That's going to be a fun little mini series to do. We're wanting to bring our love of wrestling to you in a way that gets you passionate about it as well. I talk with Greg about this all the time. There's so much to be cynical about watching the modern product that I'm done with that noise. I want to be done with the cynicism. I just want to have fun talking about wrestling. And that's what tonight was all about. Just going down through these names. We're talking about a wide range of people here, from CM Punk and Randy Orton and Edge to the Ricky Stars and the Sputnik Monroes. That's a hell of a big gulf in terms of, time periods from the 50s to the modern era. But damn, it was fun. And, I thank you, George, for being willing to come on here and break down your list as well. We'll definitely have to do more stuff like this. And you know what? If you listen tonight and you enjoyed what you hear, pound that like button. Subscribe to the channel. We got so much content already in our archives, and we're going to have so much more. Be doing more special presentations like this in the weeks to come. All of us at the Connoisseurs of Wrestling are so proud and privileged to be doing what we're doing, and we thank you for all of the wonderful support that you've given us. George, any final words before we close up shop for the night?
No, sir. I think it was a blast to do this episode, and I hope we can do something along the line like this again along the lines in the future. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for being here, and for everyone that was in the chat tonight, everyone that caught the show, thank you very much for listening. We'll be back at it again next week. Same time, same place, same channel with the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. Until then, guys, you have a wonderful week. Enjoy the baseball playoff. It's going good for the Red Sox so far. Keep your fingers crossed that holds for the rest of the night. And we're out of here. We will see you later. Take care, guys.
Good night, everybody.